The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Central Ohio APWA Funding Updates webinar. My name is Mike Fitch with the Ohio LTAP Center here at ODOT, and we appreciate your participation. As we get started, please take a moment to locate the questions box in the GoToWebinar panel. During the presentation today, please use the questions box to send in any questions you might have. Looking at the handout section of the GoToWebinar panel, please note also that a PDF copy of today's presentation is available for reference. With that, we will go ahead and turn things over to Josh Ford. Hello.
Hi, thanks, Mike. And hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us on today's LTAP and Central Ohio APWA Funding Resources Update webinar. Ahead of our webinar, the folks over at LTAP sent out a survey to both gauge interest and see what topics we should focus on. We had 89 respondents that indicated the greatest interest was surrounding bridges, safety, and general roadway, including ADA. To keep this at an hour, we're going to break this into two webinars, and today's session is going to focus on a general update, followed by bridges and culverts, and then safety. As Mike mentioned, my name is Josh Ford, and I'm a director for the Central Ohio branch of the American Public Works Association, and I will be moderating today's questions in the webinar. Joining us today to cover the general update is Betsy Ayler with Burgess & Nyepel. Betsy is an experienced client manager and funding specialist with over 23 years of funding experience. She has helped many Ohio and Midwest communities author and implement over $65 million in grant-funded projects for natural resource restoration and resilience, environmental assessment, brownfield remediation, utility infrastructure, transportation, and redevelopment. Also joining us today to cover culvert and bridge funding is John Shanks with Burgess & Nyepel. John has served in a design, peer review, or management role on many significant bridge projects designed by B&N over the past 32 years. John has experience in bridge replacements, relocations, and widening involving FEMA coordination and preparation of CLOMAR. John has served in a design, peer review, or management role on many significant bridge projects, including numerous river crossings and economical aesthetic bridges. Also joining us today to cover safety funding is Kendra Shank with Burgess & Nyepel. Kendra is a national safety expert with Burgess & Nyepel. She has nearly 12 years of experience helping state and local agencies and NPOs evaluate the safety performance of their roadways and work to implement solutions to eliminate fatalities and serious injuries. As a trusted safety expert in Ohio, she has helped agencies apply for and secure over $56 million in safety funding for improvements. And now, without further wait, I will turn things over to Betsy for a general update.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. We're honored to be here and share information about the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, also known as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Plan. I'm going to go ahead and just turn off my webcam to save bandwidth. But appreciate sharing sort of the perspective. Did the slide go there? There we go. Yeah, so today I wanted to focus on kind of my perspective, a grant writer's perspective of going through year one, right? We're all sophomores and have made it through our rookie season, so to speak, and share, the perspective of sort of what we've learned and how that can translate into empowering all of you to be better prepared for 2023. This legislation basically runs from 2022 through 2026. And, just to kind of start off the idea of how it's been, I think first of all, I'm a mom of teenagers, so I see a lot of Minecraft at my house. And in short, surviving this legislation and all of the funding that's come in place is a bit like Minecraft. In Minecraft, you mine and you craft, you explore and you repeat. You basically have to develop your own system for fitting all of the pieces together and surviving attacks. You really have two modes, survival and creative. In survival, potential endermen and creepers kind of akin to deadlines sneak up right next to you and kind of explode the world that you're trying to build. And so that's been a bit of an analogy for what it's been like. You could even say that, you know, mobs or groups of attackers in survival mode, you know, can kind of all come at once. And we've seen that, the heavy pace associated with figuring out all of the different details and the complexities. In the middle of all of that, you know, you have had many challenges, kind of an overwhelming density of text. The notice of funding opportunities, you know, can be 200 and 300 pages. They can have frequently asked questions included, and a lot to decipher and kind of mine and decode to be able to fit to your specific project. At the same time, you know, the grants require folks to be all knowledgeable in many different disciplines. So not only do you have to have a discipline in, you know, legal and technical terms, but also need, you know, fiduciary inputs, grant writing inputs, building narratives, all in real time. So today, you know, wanted to share with you a couple of things that would speak to how we've seen people manage successfully, you know, kind of going through this process, and give you some of the key takeaways as folks are facing these challenges. You know, really 6 lessons that we've learned. The first of which is to develop a grant strategy. So within your organization, you know, try and figure out in whole or in part, you know, who the players are going to be to help you manage the grant related roles, including some of those skill sets that I talked about, and then get a strategy together for how you're going to prioritize your return. Just a couple of examples in the way that we've seen people develop a strategy, you know, kind of sit down and go through, you know, their top 5 projects across the different disciplines within their organization. You know, water, wastewater, utility infrastructure, transportation, you know, parks and rec, all of the potential pieces that then have a touch point on funding. And, you know, get that list of top projects, identify, you know, 4 or 5 key grants that could fit for each one of those projects, and figure out what what do I need to do in the next 5 months to be able to better prepare. I've also seen people take their CIP list, their list of potential projects over the biennium, or, you know, within their plan list, and add a physical grant column to it to be used as a tracker to identify those opportunities and try and start sequencing deadlines for what you're going to apply for and when, and what those potential prerequisites are as a part of that process. On the utility infrastructure side, you know, that can be looking at your asset management plan and trying to figure out what your priorities are. I've also seen communities say, hey, you know, our strategy is to grow this one specific area. And if we dedicate our funds and our efforts, you know, along that path, you know, that would be a way to divide and conquer. So get a plan together. It can be something as simple as a table, you know, can be more detailed, using the tools that you have to be able to start. I think one of the other big challenges is that as engineers, we try and, you know, understand all those complexities. At some point, you just have to start, go with what you have, improvise, right, and get a grant project started or together. The second lesson would be, you know, and I can't emphasize this enough, you know, to connect with the funding agency with which you've identified would be a potential target for your grant. You know, before you invest significant time and money, you know, and typically not within the notice of funding opportunity or the NOFO. So ahead of the release, and when you're in the technical period where you're preparing an application, you know, get those folks on the phone from the agency and ask questions about eligibility, about the viability of the project, about what they've seen thus far that scores well or is successful, how it fits in with the priorities of, you know, scoring and the big picture. And the best way to do that is in just sort of a brief call. Hey, this is what we're thinking. I just wanted to familiarize you with this. To the extent that you can share any inputs, you know, that would be appreciated, and you can kind of build from there. Sophisticated organizations, if you have time to do it, build a one-page summary on your project. You know, talk about the benefits, have a map, talk about the partners that are engaged, be able to have that slick sheet ready to be able to say, this is our priority, so that you can share it not only with the agency, but to other people that may play a role. In that agency discussion, if there's a letter of support that's required, know those contacts and the requirements. Ohio Department of Transportation for federal discretionary grant requests has a 14 days deadline. So 14 days ahead of the deadline for when your grant is due, they would like to see the narrative, and you submit the information to get that letter or request letter back from them of support. That 2 weeks ahead of the deadline, to get your narrative together, you need to prepare well in advance to be able to share that. We all kind of work up to the end and are a part of that. I did include today too, if you're a small community, especially targeted under, utility structure, if you're an under 10,000 community, and hopefully you can see this, the small communities environmental infrastructure group, they have meetings, you can get your presentation together about your project, and the finance professionals and agencies will all give you feedback. So across the different sectors, what they see and what may be important, to build and connect with your project. So just, connect with the agency, get feedback, and add it in. A third lesson would be to develop, a tracking system that works for you. I kind of call this ESP, extrasensory perception, kind of like a sixth sense, a bit like sensing what's next and knowing, what you need to do to prepare. Here's just a couple of techniques. Are you currently funding studies or have them underway? Make sure that they could potentially include a section on if there are alternatives that are recommended or recommendations in your study, how you might fund them to be able to better track what's next. Are you also, including potential tasks in your RFQ or RFP that deal with, grant writing support if you're building a project and may need additional pieces that are a component of what may be required in that application? That's one really good way to track and pull in information. The other two things that I really wanted to share are these are the ones that as a grant writer, I refer to on a daily basis. The National Association of Counties has a wonderful link for the IIJA programs, deadlines, and details. And hopefully if I click this here, it'll show up for you. This is a sortable spreadsheet that pulls in all of the different programs, the agency that is implementing them, how much money was associated with that specific program, whether it's competitive or formula, some of the eligibilities, even links to the NOFOs. So while we're presenting a lot of information today, just know that this is a really good link to be able to refer to. And then also, there is the National Association of Governors has, I really like this one, their link of funding basically shows what's current. The BRIC grants are out right now, the RAISE grants are out right now with a deadline and a NOFO submitted, and then those that are forthcoming. So take a look at these links, they can be very helpful in the lesson that is, get your tracker together, kind of use that for sensing what's next and how you can prepare. These are also some additional links from both USDOT and Ohio Department of Transportation. They have their own links for the key notices of funding opportunity. Ohio has just drafted an excellent book that basically summarizes all of the resources. I'll click this just quickly so that you can see. Hopefully that pops up here, but they have this book basically that you can download it. It includes all of those opportunities, kind of breaks apart, the different tasks. Again, back to that Minecraft, kind of go through and decode and sort. And then something that was just released in the last, the Federal Highways put out this wonderful table. This is my new favorite table, where it, for the first time in a very clear way, defines project activity types. So if you're looking for a specific activity, down to the level of detail on the left side of the column here, these are all the programs that Highways has identified may have potential applicability to these eligible tasks. So you can also click on these different links and they reference the program. So here you see RAISE, Infra, these are grant programs across the top of this, both from the competitive and discretionary standpoint. So some really helpful tools have been developed over the course of the past year. Again, they're included within this so that you can go back and refer. Then a fourth lesson, and I think one of the most significant things that we've experienced, at least here in helping communities and working through technical teams, is if you can figure out within your project how to sequence the prerequisites with the many factors that are included, you can be well ahead of the game. The blue line here, or this blue triangle, as you look at these steps, where you start with a project idea and your goal is to be able to get funding all the way up through construction, blue would represent, a potential definition of in the realm of a planning grant. And brown might represent, this triangle here, might represent, a construction grant. I think one of the most challenging things of the IIJA across all the agencies is that planning, preliminary design, permitting, the study to some extent, all the way up through final design, the definitions change based on the agency. So we've seen grants that they'll pay for planning and studies, they'll pay for a part of preliminary design, they'll even pay for part of that permitting and potentially doing the benefit cost analysis. We've seen other grants that, they do not. On the construction side, these elements between, your project idea and design kind of implement, the readiness definition. And so to the extent that even after you've identified your top projects, you can break down some of those prerequisites in a real way and show in 2022, we did this, in 2023, we anticipate doing this, and break down those along the path. It can be very helpful. Not all planning grants cover design. Not all construction grants, allow for plans or any of the prerequisites that are necessary. So each program is different and has different requirements and scores these things in a different way. Really, this has been, one of the things that if you can sequence well across this 2022 to 2026, it can very much help you. I want to speak just quickly on one of the things that we, the folks here who handle the permitting associated with some of the larger transportation projects, permitting can hang you up in terms of not knowing what you need until you get to that phase. During preliminary design is when you refine what you need to do for the resource impacts, what permits will be necessary. And as you start into that process, mitigation is one of those things that you can't truly define until you're in that phase, whether or not it will be covered in the grant and how it fits, if it meets with some of the cost eligibility on either the planning and development side or on the construction side, or is in between and is something that you have to pay for on your own, is kind of different across the agencies and across the grants. So I guess as you sequence projects, just ask questions of your team, regarding permitting. They take time. The time that you start and the time that you receive approval, can be significant. And different grants score permitting differently as a part of readiness. So, take a look back at this and kind of just understand some of the basics as you formulate your plan across the grants. The fifth strategy is really about mining your data. So the IIJA followed the President's Justice 40 initiative, which references that 40% of all of the investments for covered programs that are listed in the memo, which I've linked here, should flow to disadvantaged communities. So there are really three tools. I've included a map here from the Safe Streets for All criteria that sort of references some of the stressed areas that were identified for that specific grant. the other is the underserved census tracts, EJ screen, and a new climate tool that US EPA has developed. We are seeing communities that take these data sets and these layers and try and fit projects that are within their capital improvement plan or ones that they want to prioritize, and overlay these layers to try and see if they can't, maximize including projects or combining projects together that may touch, some of these layers. And, each NOFO will give you a link for the data that that agency is looking for you to provide back. So a big point on this is, while you may have pulled these sources in the past, or some of your criteria based on state or other sources, use the links that are provided within the NOFO to be able to give them the data back. In some ways, this helps them in scoring because those data sets, right, are irrefutable. You are either within the limit or not in the limit, or you have a rank of whatever that criteria or percentage is for some of these inputs like low income, unemployment, distressed neighborhoods, or other burdens. They're really key in terms of the way that 40% of the funding is dedicated to being used in these areas. One question that came through this year is like, are you affluent? What do we do if our community or our county, is not distressed? Just a couple of creative ways in which we've seen people connect, their projects from a more affluent area with a distressed area to be able to meet that or provide opportunities, rapid bus transit, if you have a bus stop nearby, if you have other transit resources for health, education, or even trails. You can explore ways in which you can, kind of like jewels on the necklace, provide connectivity to those other areas for the benefit of, your project. So take a look at that. I want to also just share real quick, US EPA just dropped this a week and a half ago, 2 new grants that are focused on environmental justice. So if you do have a project that's within one of those areas, there's going to be $20 million for local government projects. States will be able to pool their share, different climate type projects and some other parameters. There's a webinar that's coming up that will explain these brand new grant programs and how it will flow. So take a look if that's something that would fit your project. Lastly, lesson 6, community engagement. On many of the calls with funding agencies, the first question that they ask is, how does the community feel about this project? Do you have support at the state, local, and even federal level for your project? Do you have someone on board who can be an advocate? Also, what's your plan for sharing information? Is your grant publicly available and part of your website so that people can review it? Does it include other local grassroots organizations or other engagement folks to be able to spread that gap for connectivity? So again, 6 lessons to kind of share with you just grant writers' perspective on things that, hopefully will help you succeed in year 2. And with that, I'll turn it over to John Shanks to speak more about the funding for bridges and culverts.
Hi, everyone. Again, I'm going to focus on the IIJA funding, kind of an overview of different funding opportunities for bridges and culverts. Next slide. So the big picture, IIJA affording $864 billion over a 5-year period, 403 programs, 660 billion of which are formula and 204 billion competitive. And then of that, 70% dedicated to transportation related projects. Next slide. So for the transportation portion, 591 billion, there's 141 programs currently, 81 programs formula, 60 competitive. And the focus of those are on safety, bridges, climate change, resilience, and project delivery connectivity. $350 billion of the 591 replaces the prior FAST Act multi-year highway bill, so that's the business as usual part of it. Although the 350 does represent a 25% increase over the prior highway bill. And then that funding is kind of spread over 5 years with a slight escalation each year. So it's a general overview for transportation. Next slide. So kind of drilling down now into the bridges and culverts, there's about a dozen, probably additional, but a dozen primary programs involving bridges and culverts, some focused entirely on bridges, and some others where bridges are a component of that grant. So the largest piece of that is the Bridge Formula Program and Bridge Investment Program, totaling $40 billion in new program dollars. This is the largest investment in bridges since construction of the highway interstate system. So, it's a big deal. I'll cover this on the next couple slides in a little more detail. Others like the RAISE grants, which prioritizes safety, mobility, community connectivity. Infra grants, focused on national and regional significant freight and highway projects. And the Protect Formula program, which focuses on resiliency, improving resiliency of infrastructure. I'll cover that a little bit more targeted to the bridge side of things on a later slide. And mega projects, and those are large complex projects that are difficult to fund by other means and have national and regional economic mobility and safety. And then I kind of looked into that a little bit, and the language sort of targets that to anadromous fish passage improvements. So those are fish that travel from saltwater to freshwater. So that's going to be primarily focused on coastal states. I'm not sure that Lake Erie qualifies for that. There are some fish that are, that make it from the lakes up into freshwater rivers, but I'm not sure they qualify as anadromous. But then there's the wildlife crossing pilot program. So bridges that might provide wildlife crossings. Next slide. Oh, on this one, the image of I think Betsy hit on this with one of her links, but I found the ODOT's discretionary grant opportunities document is pretty helpful and has all these spelled out in a pretty succinct manner. Next slide. So back on the bridge formula and investment programs, the formula program, $27.5 billion over 5 years, channels money to the states for distribution. And these are dedicated to bridges that are in poor condition or in fair condition, in danger of falling into the poor condition category. And the amount to each state is based on the number of bridges they have in their inventory that are in fair and poor condition. So states like Ohio that have done a pretty good job of maintaining their bridges, that might kind of affect how much they're getting, but they're getting $483 million at $97 million a year. 15% of those funds reserved for the off-system, non-federal highway bridges, and 100% federal share for the locals. Next slide. The discretionary portion of that, the bridge investment program, is $12.5 billion over 5 years, competitive. And that's focused on replacing, rehabbing, preserving, and protecting bridges. And they allow bundling bridges in a single project when you're seeking that funding. It also is for replace and rehabilitation of culverts to improve flooding control and habitat connectivity. And they're issuing those grants in like 3 focused waves. One project type, the large bridge projects over 100 million, which receive 50% project funding and 50 million minimum awards. That's one type. The next is bridge projects under 100 million that receive 80% level of funding with a $2.5 million minimum award. and then planning grants for those bridges. They've already announced selection of the large bridge and the planning grants, and I think the bridge projects, the ones under 100 million, are still pending. 50% of the bridge investment program is to be used for the large bridge projects, and for off-system bridges, it's up to a 90% funding level. So for letters of support and additional information, you can contact Andrew Shepler at ODOT Grants Coordinator, and he can provide assistance with further thought and support for those projects. Next slide. So on the bridge investment program, here's a kind of showing who different states and projects that won the planning grants for 2022. 24 projects, 20 million. And Ohio received none on this, not much for 1 year. Next slide. Okay, and for the large bridge grant projects in 2022, there were only 4 projects selected. The Brent Spence, near and dear to our hearts here in Ohio, is 1.4 billion of that. Other notables are the Golden Gate Suspension Bridge seismic retrofit, Gold Star Memorial Bridge in Connecticut. So next slide. The Bridge Investment Program prioritizes projects that states have applied for funding but have yet to receive grants. And the Transportation Secretary is required during that 5-year period to award each state not fewer than 1 large project or 2 other than large projects. So, you know, one or the other of that is what's required to be given to a state. And then, you know, for Ohio, Brent Spence checks the box already for that. It doesn't mean that we can't get more out of Ohio, but, you know, it is telling that, okay, we've already met the minimum required. So that's worth noting. Next slide. Circling back on the PROTECT program that promotes resiliency, transformative, efficient, and cost-saving transportation. You got to come up with a cool word, so you got to put all those other words in there to get it. But resiliency is the focus. There's the bridge-related elements in PROTECT include lengthening or raising bridges to increase waterway openings in response to extreme weather effects, and that can include increasing size and number of drainage structures, adding scour protection at bridges, and also seismic retrofit of bridges. So these, you know, if you think about a competitive world, the coastal states that have the higher risk extreme weather events or higher intensity of seismic events, you know, might be weighted more favorably. So again, something to keep in mind, but I think, you know, there could be a place for Ohio as well in these. Next slide. So coming back down to the bridge formula program and just how things are getting channeled in Ohio. So Ohio Department of Transportation bridge funding, ODOT distributes approximately 400 million per year right now. That's 4 times what the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law requires. And they're using the same framework to distribute that money, but just with increased dollars with the help of the Bridge Formula Program. So the County Engineers Association local bridge program at the LBR is receiving an additional 40 million a year, which is essentially doubling their program up to 75 million per year. And this is starting to have the effect of fueling more design build projects at the county level to, you know, get those through the pipeline. Starting to see more of that. So for counties, you know, contacting Dean Ringel, CEAO, for, you know, additional information about that program and its additional funding. And then on the municipal city side, the municipal bridge program is receiving an additional $7 million a year. And the contacts there, Andrea Stevenson and Nicole Lawhorn at ODOT Office of Local Programs. And then there are other programs there at ODOT, Local Major Bridge, District Bridge Preservation, Major Bridge Program, and Credit Bridge. Next slide. All right, with that, we'll hand off to Kendra.
Thanks, John. So I will be talking about the safety funding that came out of the IIJA. So next slide, please. So the Safe Streets and Roads for All grant is a completely new competitive program. So this is not related to the program-based HSIP funding that states receive every year. This grant will be available annually through fiscal year 2026. This grant supports planning, infrastructure, behavioral, and operational initiatives to prevent deaths and serious injuries on our roadways. A total of $6 billion will be awarded over the life of the grant, with $1 billion being awarded for fiscal year 2022. In 2022, the Notice of Funding Opportunity, or the NOFO, was announced in May, with applications due in September. We're still waiting on notification of awards, but they're expected any day now, hopefully in January, but early 2023. So right now we do anticipate that the 2023 grant cycle will follow similar to the 2022 cycle. But before I dive too far deep into this grant, I do want to preface this, like Betsy said, there is a ton of information out there for this grant opportunity. So I've done my best to kind of boil it down for this presentation. But if you're interested in and have more questions, reach out to me. I've got more materials I can share with you and provide you more information. So with that, we'll jump on in. Next slide, please. So the funding provisions, a lot of this, again, is based off of the 2022 NOFO, as we haven't seen the new 2023 NOFO yet. But the way that it was broken out in 2022 is that no more than 15% of the funds can go to any one state. So that works out to be about $150 million per state. Obviously, not all states being equal. But that's one of the stipulations. So in Ohio, if you're looking to go after one, it would be really good to coordinate with others in the state, because it may be that only one of you gets that grant awarded. So coordination with your neighbors is great. And then according to the 2022 grant, 40% of the funds must go to safety plans or supplemental safety planning activities, and 60% will be for safety projects. So as the grant continues, it's expected that this funding, less will go towards planning and more will go to implementation. One of the requirements of the plan is, or of this grant, if you're going to implementation, is that you have to have an eligible plan. So in this initial kind of round, it was getting that plan in place and then focusing on implementation. But as future rounds are released, likely more towards implementation. But we'll know more with each notice of funding opportunity. It's important to note that there is a 20% local match for these grants. All of these funds must be from non-federal sources. So they can be from the applicant, they can be from other non-federal sources, including the state. So working with ODOT, if you're chasing safety funding, there is a portion of safety funding that the state is state funded, not federally funded. So working with them to make sure that what you're using as a match is not federal, but is coming from the state. Next slide, please. So the eligible uses, again, it's for two very clear purposes. One is to develop a comprehensive safety action plan or to conduct supplemental planning activities. So if you've completed a plan, but it needs to be updated based with new crash data, or it's been a while, doesn't meet the newness of the requirement, or if you want to dive deeper into the analysis to determine potential projects that could be used, then implemented with a different grant, that would be a supplemental safety planning activity. The money can also be used to carry out associated plans and strategies identified in your approved safety action plan. So that would be the implementation grant. It's important to note that applicants can apply for awarded a planning grant, an action plan grant in a few years. Are you then eligible for an implementation grant? We haven't seen that yet, but we believe that you would still be eligible for that. Next slide, please. So here's the funding provisions. Again, this is based off of 2022. So this could change with the next NOFOs, but basically it outlines the amount of grants they're planning to give and their minimums and maximums. One of the things that we've learned over the process of last year is that while it states a minimum for the action plan, a minimum of 200,000, a maximum of $1 million, there's actually no funding minimum or maximum. They put that in there, but then they kind of backed off that and said it's a suggested minimum and maximum. It's to kind of give you an idea of what the minimums and maximums might be. And as Betsy kind of indicated early in this presentation, but also our last one, a rural area is defined as an area outside of an urbanized area or within an urbanized area fewer than 200,000 people. So that's kind of what we're using for rural and urban areas. Again, there's sources online that we can use to identify what area you are in specifically. Next slide, please. So the start dates and period of performance, one of the big caveats, and again is yet to really be seen, is that we don't know when the money will actually be awarded. So the notification of award is due any day. According to the NOFO, the money will be awarded within 12 months after the grant awards have been announced. Applicants who have never received federal funding from DOT before are encouraged to partner with eligible applicants in the same region, such as an MPO, that have an established financial relationship with DOT and knowledge of federal grant administration requirements. When we're looking at the time in which you have to expend the money, action plans are typically 12 to 24 months, and implementation grants can't exceed 5 years. And from our understanding of that grant wording, construction must be done in 5 years. So if you're using it for construction, from the time of the award to shovels down, project open is 5 years. Next slide, please. So one of the big components here are the eligible applicants. So a state is not eligible. So ODOT is not chasing these projects, but ODOT can be a partner in the project. They can support the project, they can be on board with the project, they can provide a letter of support, especially if it's on their roadway. We'll need that, but basically it's any subdivision of a state. So a metropolitan planning organization, a tribe, any local agency, county, and any combination of those. You could have a multi-jurisdictional group that apply, but you should identify a lead applicant as that primary point of contact. So again, a state choose how to spend it, but in this case, this money is going to the locals and they get to choose how to spend it. Next slide, please. So I'll talk a little bit about the action plan. So basically, this grant includes 8 components. If to do an action plan, you have to meet these 8 components. There's checklists involved with that. What this does is it makes, if you go after an action plan, you will have it, it will have to then be certified to go after an implementation grant. So this is the action plan that you'll develop as part of the process to then be able to go after implementation. What we've seen right now is that agencies that don't have action plans, but maybe aren't going after action plan grants, are doing these plans on their own to get them eligible to then be able to go after implementation. So that is an important thing to note. You don't have to go through the action plan grant to have an eligible action plan to apply for implementation. Next slide, please. For the supplemental plan activities, like I kind of said before, this is to supplement a current safety action plan that you may have in place. So updating data analysis, doing more stakeholder engagement, completing a feasibility study. This is just some of the examples they have in the NOFO, but that's not an exhaustive list. To apply for a supplemental plan, you have to have an established action plan with those components described in the previous slide, or one that's substantially similar, so that you can just add on to it. And one thing to note too is that the plan components could be contained within several documents. I know multiple local agencies tend to have multiple plans, and so there could be pieces and parts in different plans that we can piece together to have what's considered an action plan. Next slide, please. So to apply for the action plan, it's actually really a light lift. There's the typical standard forms. There's a key information table, which is really kind of shown below there with population, what's your fatalities, and then that calculates your fatality rate. And then they want some information about the census, specifically in underserved communities. So looking at that, it actually gives you links to go find that, the census data and FARS data. And then there's a 300-word narrative to respond to the selection criteria about why you're looking for a action plan. And then if you are applying for supplemental action plan activities, there is that self-certification eligibility worksheet to identify that that plan that you have in place meets most of the criteria outlined, those 8 points on the previous slide. And then it asks for a map of your region and then the amount of funding that you are requesting. Next slide, please. So switching over to implementation grants, there's a long list of eligible activities, including the table that Betsy showed earlier. Really the main things for these eligible activities, they must include carrying out projects and strategies in an action plan, and they must be directly related to addressing the safety problems. You can include planning or design for these projects, but they have to be part of an action plan. So on the next slide, there's a list of ineligible activities, and we get this question a lot: what's eligible, what's ineligible? Really, if the main purpose of the project is not safety, it is not eligible. So projects that are doing roadway widening, for example, a lot of times those will not be considered safety improvements. If it's expanding capacity to improve level of service for motorists, that's not eligible. Also, maintenance projects are not eligible. So repaving a roadway to address potholes isn't eligible. But if you resurface with high friction surface treatment to mitigate wet crashes, that could be eligible. So it, again, has to tie to a safety problem identified in the action plan and be safety specific. Next slide, please. So this summarizes the application process for the implementation grant. It is a little bit more extensive. There is a 10-page narrative involved that includes an overview of the project, the location, a response to the selection criteria, and some information about the project readiness. Again, if you're applying for implementation, at the top there it has the key information table looking for your population, the population in underserved communities. So again, gives you that link to census data to find that information. And then again, you're applying for an implementation grant, which means you have to have an eligible action plan. So you need to fill out a self-certification eligibility worksheet to prove that you have an action plan that meets the qualifications. And you'll also have to provide a link to that action plan in this application. So next slide, please. So in summary, I know I've thrown a ton of information at you in this portion, and I've only really scratched the surface. But to summarize, I wanted to leave you with some next steps to help you prepare if you're interested in applying for an SS4A grant. So joint applications are viewed more favorably in these grants. So maybe collaborate with your neighboring and overlapping agencies, including ODOT, to look for potential opportunities. Determine if your agency has an eligible safety action plan. I know many MPOs have plans, and some may cover the local agencies who wish to apply for the grant. And if your agency doesn't have a safety action plan, begin the process of either writing your own or scoping and costing a plan so you know how much funding to apply for with the action plan grant. And then you can also review your program projects and your existing safety plans or your capital improvement programs or TIPs, long-range transportation plans, and determine if you have any eligible projects or programs that could be submitted as part of an implementation grant. And right now we're anticipating that the NOFO is anticipated in May, if it follows the same schedule like we're anticipating it did in 2022. And while it seems like we're only in January, there's plenty of time, and there's also plenty of time between May and September. It always flies by. So getting that plan in place so that once the NOFO is out, you can hit the ground running and ensure that you've got a great application to be submitted in September will be critical. So again, this is just a snapshot of all of this information. There's a ton more, so please reach out to me or ask questions if you need anything more specific. With that, I think I will turn it back over to Josh to wrap us up and do questions.
Yep, thanks, Kendra. Thanks to all of our presenters today. Everyone out there, all the attendees, this is the time here to enter some questions. We've gotten one that's come up so far that Kendra, I believe this one is for you. It is, do you have any examples of qualitative models in the expected ROI, for example, enhanced quality of life for residents' feedback?
Yeah, so for the safety program, one of the benefits of this SS4A is we actually don't have to provide ROI or benefit cost improvements or calculations, but we have done that for other grants. I know we did that for one of the bridge projects. And so there's a whole bunch of information online, and I'm sure we can share some with you as well of calculating that. It's obviously a hard thing to quantify the quality of life numbers, but it's definitely something that we've tried to do, and there's great examples out there of doing that, you know, time spent in the car and congestion and things like that that can be used.
Betsy and John, anything to add to that?
Not for me.
I don't have anything.
Okay. All right, well, it looks like that's the only question that we've got in so far. For everyone out there, I will say we've got our contact info in here, so if there's any questions that come up, please feel free to reach out to me or Betsy, John, or Kendra if you've got any specific questions, and we'll make sure to get back to you. But if there's nothing else that comes up, yeah, we got one. The PowerPoint is available. It's actually in the handouts. If you look over on the GoToWebinar menu, maybe Mike, you can direct them a little bit better than I can, but there's a handouts tab that you can go through and click on that to access the PowerPoint.
Yes, thanks, Josh. In that GoToWebinar panel, please feel free to download the PDF copy of today's presentation. And within the next few days, we will also be sending out a follow-up email to all the participants. That'll include a link to the recording of this webinar on our YouTube channel, and also a link to that PDF presentation. At the start, we mentioned we did send out that quick survey of funding questions about a month ago. So for Josh and our panel, if there's any other items from the survey that you'd like to chat about, we do have a few minutes available.
Well, thanks, Mike. I think we'll go through, and we're going to have a part 2 to this. So hopefully a lot of the other questions and topics we weren't able to get to, specifically focused around some general roadway items and accessibility, ADA ProWag, that type of stuff we'll go through to cover there, and then we can wrap it up with anything that we did not touch on. But I think that if there are no other questions that come in, we can go through and wrap this up. So thanks everybody for joining us.
Yes, I'd like to thank Josh and all of the presenters for speaking today. We really appreciate it. We did just have a question from Clifford, so let me forward this. Clifford says, how do we sign up for notices of future presentations like this? Okay, so if you want to go to our Ohio LTAP website, we have a sign up page where you can join our LTAP email list, and we certainly welcome additional folks to subscribe to our LTAP emails. You can also go to the available training page of our LTAP website, and we list our upcoming training courses and webinars there. But again, want to thank all of our presenters today. We really appreciate that, and thanks everybody for your participation. Enjoy the rest of your day.